Why is USAID destroying classified documents in some last act of swamp hubris? What the heck is going on here? Our friend Mike Benz joins us now. He is the executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. Mike, what's going on at USA? Well, there's a lot that's going on at USAID, not as much maybe these days as before, but why would they be destroying classified documents in some flurry at the end?
Well, it's a very strange series of events that popped off. I initially described it as a five-alarm fire because it was a very unusual email that Erica Carr, the executive secretary, sent out, which said that there was going to be an all-day group event yesterday to shred and burn all the remaining documents in the classified safes and the personnel records. Erica Carr is someone who joined USAID during the Obama administration, was named the executive secretary the first week of the Biden administration, and has been kept over by Trump 1. After I amplified this issue, a bunch of folks at USAID who I know and trust called me and said, actually, this is normal practice. This is where we at the politicals who remain here, because remember, they had 14,000 employees. It's down to about 290 hand-picked ones. They said that this is a relatively standard practice, but the language in the email was pretty extreme. It was to shred all documents and to reserve the burn bags for when the shredder gets overloaded or overheated, effectively, that this was a sort of fire sale. Now, it sort of makes sense from the perspective that USAID is in the process of shutting down. They're leaving the building. At some point, these documents need to be handled, and the process has to happen at some point for discarding paper records. But Mike, I still have lingering concerns about the speed at which this is being done. It's not usual that you have this kind of fire sale, going out of business event where you need to reserve the burn bags for when the shredder is being used too heavily. And it's part of the reassurance that was given to me by people who are at the agency is that there are digital duplicates of the vast majority of these documents, and that it's rare for USAID to be the originating agency when it comes to classification. That is, USAID primarily handles classified documents that come from the State Department or the CIA or the Department of Defense, but very rare is not very it's not very comforting to me, because Samantha Power was probably the most crooked USAID administrator in USAID history, and that's saying a lot. John Bolton was handed the USAID Hand Grenade Award when he ran policy and budget there in the 1980s. But Samantha Power fully weaponized that agency. And to me, it's highly possible that Samantha Power could have classified a significant number of USAID documents, put them in these safes, and then simply you don't have duplicates at the other agencies if they weren't shared around. And something like this would be a way to legally dispose of those documents if a digital duplicate was not provided. And also, digital duplicates can have flaws. We saw this with the FBI during Operation Crossfire Hurricane. They deleted the emails and text messages off of the special agent phones once John Durham launched his investigation. We saw this with the corrupted files at the FBI over the J6 pipe bomber. It's quite possible that something like that could happen in this case as well. This is sort of like the electronic voting machine issue. If you don't have the paper records, you don't necessarily have a faithful duplicate. Last thing is, we saw this again with the Whitey Bulger case when the FBI went to prosecute him. And it turned out that the digital file they produced in court was not actually the full and correct document on Whitey Bulger that was kept in the classified safes at the FBI. There was a paper document that had a whole additional section attached at the end that completely inverted the history that was presented originally in court. So given that there are going to be no new USAID documents produced, I don't understand why these can't be moved safely to the National Archives and why there needs to be this rush to delete it all at the end.
The fight for life is ongoing day in and day out, and on the front lines of it, Preborn. Preborn has a network of clinics across the nation who have a very simple but profoundly important mission. which is to save the lives of as many tiny babies as they possibly can. And they do this by putting their clinics in areas of the country where abortion rates are highest and offering women an alternative to abortion with love and care and support. Now, this process usually starts with an ultrasound because once mom sees that tiny heartbeat, she knows the choice here has to be for life. But preborn needs your help in this mission. They get no government funding. All you have to do and what you can do right now to help them is go to preborn.com/buck. That's preborn.com/BUCK. Consider donating $28 a month to be a sponsor for Preborn's incredibly important network, saving lives day in and day out. What do you think is the most troubling stuff that we have found out now that Trump has taken the helm and Elon and Doge have gone in there? What is the stuff that everybody should remember about what USAID was really doing versus what the public maybe thought it was doing?
Well, there's so many categories of it. What the public thinks that it was doing was humanitarian assistance to foreign countries. And the people who are one level above that in terms of knowledgeability will appreciate that there's some soft power role in that. For example, we supply humanitarian assistance to foreign countries, and in return, we get influence over the local governments or the local political movements or the local judges or the local indigenous communities. But in fact, there's really a USAID Truman Show that where virtually every function in modern society, whether that's the media, the social media companies, whether that's the unions, whether that's politicians, judges, prosecutors, and even terrorist groups and narco cartels, drug cartels, are all on USAID payroll around the world and even here at home, which is something that should never be allowed to happen. There was this domestic foreign firewall that was systematically breached by USAID, with USAID not only paying media companies, but also paying foundations that do a significant amount of domestic work. And they're getting tens or sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars from USAID to be weaponized against domestic opponents. But there are still many layers of unexplored terrain here, given that USAID is effectively an intelligence agency with no restrictions on it. See, when the CIA does a covert action, they have to get a presidential finding for it, meaning there needs to be a written sign-off from the U.S. president to do any act of any covert action at the CIA. USAID does not have to go through with that procedure, which means that USAID is effectively the clearinghouse when there's a rogue element at CIA or DOD or state who doesn't think the president will approve, or if the president doesn't want to be seen as approving, there's a layer of plausible deniability by simply calling it democracy promotion at USAID. And I think the terrorism aspect of this is really significant. Given that Syria is so much in the news these days, you had a USAID-funded terrorist rebel faction effectively take control of the country. Mohammed al-Jalani, the leader of HTS, which overthrew that government back in December of last year, there was a $10 million bounty out for his head under the Trump 1 State Department. They then received financial assistance from USAID and toppled the government of Syria. They're now the de facto head of Syria, going around executing thousands or tens of thousands of ethnic minority groups in the country. It's going to cause huge schisms throughout the Middle East as that situation develops. And USAID has its fingerprints all over those terrorist groups, just as they have it all over the Taliban, just as they have it all over terrorist groups in Africa, in the Sahel region, as well as in Central Asia and in Pakistan, and particularly in the Western Hemisphere.
When you say fingerprints on those groups, so do we know that there was USAID money, meaning our money, but through the prism or the cutout of USAID going directly to those groups?
Yes, this was actually testified by USAID administrator folks in Congress just 3 weeks ago. There's Middle East Monitor and other reporting outlets have also disclosed hundreds of millions of dollars. I believe it's in the billions of dollars, because if the CIA wants to support those groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front, all these designated terrorist groups, and the president doesn't want to do it, then they can simply launder it through USAID, and it'll take the form of logistical funds or shelter and housing or public health, and all these things get laundered through USAID.
So that's an end run on material support to terrorism concerns, right? Basically, that's what that means.
Oh, and in fact, USAID, the Inspector General report from a month ago even showed how there was a fatal flaw in the contracting system at USAID where grantees, if you're getting a grant from USAID, you need to go through with the standard OFAC reporting, this sort of anti-terrorism financing set of laws, but contractors are not subject to that. So effectively, contractors can be used to completely end run the sort of money laundering obligations that banks are subject to, that anyone who uses the international SWIFT system is subject to. And so all of this is done to prop up these paramilitary terrorist proxy groups who, as Hillary Clinton said to Jake Sullivan in the WikiLeaks email from 2011, when they said Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, and now an Al-Qaeda offshoot now runs the government of Syria, and you see USAID giving them something like $122 million in financing, you can understand how these dirty deeds of statecraft are outsourced to USAID.
Earlier this week, on Wednesday morning, a conversation came out on video between my father and me. He shared his most recent prediction on what's next in the stock markets. This is in my dad's wheelhouse. He made his life's work predicting the markets with a lot of success. My dad made his living researching and predicting the stock markets, and now you can see his latest prediction and the thinking behind it online. It's at a website set up for you to watch on demand, disruption2025.com. It's video, and it's super easy for you to register free of charge to check this out. My dad created a name for himself on Wall Street with his big prediction back in 1987 that the stock market was going to crash, and it did. His predictions since then are too numerous to mention, but needless to say, you want to check out his next one. Sign up for this free event. Go watch it yourself. Disruption2025.com. That's disruption2025.com. Paid for by Paradigm Press. What do you think is going to be the next nasty log that Trump and Doge kick over to see what's underneath it within the government apparatus?
Well, there's a few. I'll tell you a couple off the top that I'd like to see immediately. One of them is a review of all the USAID, State Department, Pentagon, National Endowment for Democracy, and Department of Labor funds that are given to unions. This is a really nasty element of rent-a-riot behavior that has been a part of the CIA toolkit for now 50-some years. When we switched to a small wars model at the Pentagon, we transitioned from primarily using tanks and fighter jets to using street movements, these so-called color revolutions or people-powered revolutions. And unions played the major role in being the muscle on the ground when it comes to surrounding the parliament building and violently ousting a president from office, as was done in the 2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine, as was done by the Biden administration to the government of Bangladesh at the end of last year, as was planned to be done if Trump won the 2020 election by a group called the Transition Integrity Project, run by senior military and intelligence officials here in the U.S. And the unions play the dominant role in that, in particular the AFL-CIO, which is the largest union here in the U.S. It used to be known as the AFL-CIA by the New Left in the 1960s and 70s because the revealed pattern of partnerships with the CIA's international, the AFL-CIO's international branch, it has something like 75 international branches in countries around the world and was a constant partner of the CIA when they were fomenting street revolution protests abroad and would come to be weaponized against the anti-Vietnam War left in the 1970s. They play a major role in statecraft today. The AFL-CIO headquarters is basically parked just a few blocks from the White House. They had an agreement with the Chamber of Commerce to shut down the country if Trump won the Electoral College back in 2020. They received tens of millions of dollars from the National Endowment for Democracy's Solidarity Center and from the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Affairs. We saw this, for example, in Brazil. There's this lurking issue around internet censorship with all these different countries balkanizing their internet to block X. We saw Brazil ban X. We see the European Union pursuing these. Well, the unions all backed Lula in Brazil. Lula was from the Workers' Party, and unions were his primary backers. And And I've personally found tens of millions of dollars flowing directly from the Biden Department of Labor to these very union groups in Brazil backing Lula. Now, that's just in Brazil. And I think I've so far found around $30 million just from the Department of Labor. Now, the AFL-CIO is also at war with Elon Musk and Tesla because of the refusal of Elon to unionize the Tesla workforce. I have no doubt that the AFL-CIO has a hand in these protests against the Tesla car dealerships, and that's being coordinated by these groups like Indivisible and Move On and these Reid Hoffman funded groups that all have deep, deep connections to the unions. And frankly, I have no problem. I'm not pro or anti-union, but when you're subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars and we're paying to be protested against, that's a horse of a different color. And I think there's a major scandal there waiting beneath the surface to be unbound.
What do you think happens now that it seems about, I don't know, 30-40% of the Department of Education's workforce has been told, pack up your stuff? How does this play out?
I think it's fascinating. I mean, the role of the Department of Education, I think, has largely been a pernicious one. We have not advanced up the PISA score scale. We have not advanced, since the Department of Education's creation. I think U.S. education has only fallen farther and farther behind other countries, ones with far less GDP and a far lower standard of living. I'm not convinced that there's a correlation between more Department of Education activity or funding and higher education in the U.S. But what you do see is a very corrupt nexus between the universities and their government funding, whether that's from the Department of Education or whether that's from USAID or DARPA or NIH. There is no free market in the education system, which makes it very difficult for new entrants with better ideas or more innovative educational techniques to be able to make inroads into the market, because you can't compete against these massive endowments and effectively the government cartel over education. And so I think breaking that cartel is an important component in creating a genuine free market in the education space. We saw, for example, and I reported some of this recently because we see this major issue popping off right now with Columbia and these other major universities. Well, Columbia is there's a funny story around that they're the group that administers the Pulitzer Prize, the same Pulitzer Prize awarded to the Russiagate fraudsters in 2017. They were given a Pulitzer for essentially fraudulent work. The Pulitzer was awarded to Reuters in 2024. Reuters, who got $300 million in government contracts and grants during the Biden administration. $300 million. It's just a huge amount. And the Pulitzer was given to them for their write-up on misconduct at all of Elon Musk's companies, X, Neuralink, SpaceX, Tesla. It was basically just a hit piece on Elon Musk and everything he does, and that's who Columbia, effectively through the Pulitzer Foundation, awarded that prize to. Columbia also is deeply in bed with the blob, the foreign policy establishment, for all this USAID work. Sovietology, the Russian studies and area studies, African studies, Asian studies, Latin American studies, all these common majors at universities really came from Columbia back in the 1950s, when the architect of this setup, this guy Philip Mosley, who worked closely with the CIA, he was previously was a high-ranking State Department official before he came to Columbia and set up this nexus, and basically joined these area studies groups at the universities with the CIA and the State Department and the Defense Department by having the major university centers, institutes, and departments serve as an interlocutor role for statecraft. So they would bring over Russian emigres. They would gather intelligence in foreign countries. They do the exchange programs and seed people over there, all while coordinating with the CIA on all of that. Philip Mosley had a CIA security clearance. He personally consulted Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA at the time. You now see this in basically every major university, and the endowments make bank off of all of this. There's a really sick example from the 1990s when the Harvard endowment was together with the George Soros investment fund, I think it was the Quantum Fund, were given special access to the sell-off of the Russian state assets when they transitioned from communism to capitalism in the 1990s. Harvard set up something called the Harvard Institute for International Development, which was given about $500 million by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, to be the primary, effectively, USAID contractor to privatize those state assets. And then the endowment fund of the university got first pick at all those privatized assets. And so if Harvard was able to secure hundreds of millions or low billions of dollars for their endowment through that process, I wonder, is Columbia doing the same thing? Is the University of Pennsylvania, which housed the Penn Biden Center, and Amy Gutmann, who was the head of it when I was there back in the early 2000s and became Joe Biden's ambassador to Germany during the time we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, is the University of Pennsylvania endowment in on that gig? There needs to be a full review, not just of the Department of Education, funding or USAID funding, but really the role of these endowments in being hitched to the star of the blob and profiting themselves, pocketing it for themselves. It doesn't trickle down to the students in terms of diminished tuition. These are powerhouse businesses, not really 501c3s. They have $50 billion in the Harvard endowment, and I think much of that is ill-gotten gains from partnerships with the CIA, the State Department, the Defense Department. And as Trump world is reorganizing this entire structure, I think that needs to be looked at closely.
Mike Benz, fascinating stuff. Let's have you back again soon because we're at time for now. But the Foundation for Freedom Online is your organization. People should go check out what you're doing. And really interesting. Please come back and we'll talk to you more about all the dismantling of the deep state that's going on. People need to know about this.
Thank you, Buck.